Welcome to the final chapters of the Nowhere Emporium. I'm going to get through three chapters. I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. One, it's the end of the book, so it's good to hear it all at once. Two, it's the last day of term, so it might be a slightly longer video today. Chapter 35, The Challenge. Daniel sat in stunned silence as the theatre lights came back up. He tried to wrap his head around what he'd seen, and once again, in the back room of his mind, there was something jumping out at him, screaming to be noticed. An idea, a possibility. Beside him, Ellie's shoulders were bobbing up and down, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ellie? I can't believe it, Daniel. She died all because of a book. You saw it, and Papa didn't mean to kill her. Of course he didn't, said Daniel. He shivered at the thought of Michelle lying dead on the floor. Mr. Silver didn't even want to fight. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sharp's the monster. A sneer of disgust crept over Ellie's face. He stepped right over her. Like she was a piece of dirt. She was my mum. She was his little girl, and if he can do that to her, then what will he do to us? Her wide eyes were miniature versions of Mr. Silver's. Daniel, that man's a monster. We've got to get rid of him and save Papa. Daniel. Daniel? Daniel's mind had been turning cogs and gears, clicking into pace. The idea in his head had caught fire. Ellie, he said, I realise I haven't been here very long, but I reckon I know how Mr. Silver works better than anyone. Something he said in the film we just watched, it got me thinking. I can't be sure, but I might know where your Papa is. She stared at him. You do? Where? I can't tell you yet. It's safer if I'm the only one who's in on it. You're going to have to trust me. I have an idea. I'm going to ask you to do something. It'll be dangerous, but I think it's the only chance we have. Ellie returned Daniel's stare, her jaw set. Anything, she said. Good, said Daniel. First of all, I have to pay another wee visit to the Room of Secrets. Grey Manhattan rain pelted the sepia-stained window at the Nowhere Emporium. Vindictor Sharp sat at Mr. Silver's desk, throwing 3 silver knives one after the other at the stuffed polar bear. Back at the fountain when the boy had first snatched the book, Sharp had given chase, determined to find him and squeeze the air from his lungs, but the infernal Emporium had sent him running in circles. He had returned to the shop front, deciding instead to wait the boy out. A whisper from the red velvet curtain caught his attention, and he spun to see the boy standing, straight-backed, defiant. Daniel had never been as frightened of anything as he was of Sharp. Nothing, not even Spud Harper and his gang, came close to the cold blue stare that was fixing him now. He made himself as tall as he could. I know where Mr. Silver is hiding, he said. Sharp was upon him in a heartbeat, pinning him like a rag doll against a wall, the silver blade pressed to his throat. He took the Book of Wonders from Daniel's pocket and tossed it onto the desk. Please elaborate, he said. Daniel swallowed, trying to keep breathing. No, I won't. The knife dug into his skin, but not quite enough to draw blood. I could torture you, you know, Sharp said. I could make you tell me. Slowly, Daniel reached into his pocket. When he pulled his hand out, a tiny snow globe sat in his palm. Sharp looked at it. Am I supposed to know what that is? It's a secret, said Daniel. It's the secret you want to know. It's where you can find Mr. Silver. I figured it out. Sharp snatched the secret from his hand. Daniel relaxed a little as the knife was withdrawn from his throat. Sharp took the secret, shook it, held it to his ear. It won't work, Daniel went on. That's the whole idea of a secret, isn't it? I don't want you to know where Silver is, and as long as the secret is in that globe, you can't force it out of me. Electric blue eyes flicked from the secret to Daniel. Why did you come? Daniel shrugged. To challenge you? Excuse me? I know how it works. I know that if I challenge you, you either accept or you give up. So, I challenge you. I'll write a wonder into the book just for you. Inside it will be your challenge, and you'll write one for me. We'll go in at the same time, and whoever comes out first is the winner. Sharp smiled. If I win? He asked. Daniel pointed to the secret. I'll help you find Mr. Silver. I know you need him to die for the book to be yours, but he's not going to come out to play. You'll have to wait till the Emporium collapses on top of him, till it's totally dead, and that could take a long time. This way, if you win, you can kill him, and the book will be yours. Sharp nodded agreeably. And if I win, continued Daniel, you leave us alone and you don't ever come back. He held out a hand. Agreed? Sharp scratched the silver stubble on his chin, then his hand swallowed the boy's and an electric ripple passed through the room. Agreed. Daniel walked to the desk, trying to look more confident than he felt. As he picked up one of Silver's fountain pens, his mind began to fill with doubts. Would the Emporium support the creation of 2 new wonders? Was his idea really as good as he first thought? What sort of challenge would Sharp think up for him? What if he lost? Was he gambling an awful lot on the belief that he was good enough to beat this man? That the Emporium would help him? He opened the book to an empty page. I'll link the doors so they should appear together. Right away, Daniel Holmes, said Sharp. Right away. Daniel gripped the pen so tight that his hand wouldn't shake. Then he pressed the nib to the page and the ink began to flow. Chapter 36. Daniel versus Vindictus. The doors did appear together, as Daniel had predicted. Thankfully, the corridor in which the new doors stood was largely intact, though the first signs of familiar cracks were creeping into the polished slabs. The doors were identical, arched and shining black with a gold doorknob. The only difference between the two were the nameplates, each displaying the name of the challenger. As Daniel placed the Book of Wonders on the floor between the 2 doors, he sensed suddenly that the corridor was filled with people. He straightened up, looked around, and his eyes widened. The Emporium staff, at least those who were able, had come. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, a ragtag band of misfits, some dabbing black ink from their leaking noses, or leaning on their neighbours. Leading the pack, standing tall, was Caleb. He nodded to Daniel. Come on, Daniel, he yelled, to a smattering of cheers. Show him he's boss, said someone else at the back of the crowd. We believe in you. Daniel looked at Sharp, and suddenly his opponent did not seem quite so huge, or his task so impossible. He nodded to the crowd, his friends, more thankful to have them with him than he could say. Then he said to Vindictus Sharp, Ready? Sharp unfolded his arms and did not try to stifle the smug smile that crossed his lips. Always. They each turned to face the door that contained their challenge. They moved forwards and reached for the doorknobs. Then they opened the doors and stepped into the unknown. Daniel was falling. The world around him was black and damp. He landed with a splash in a pool of water so cold that he thought his heart might freeze. Salt water filled his mouth, spurted from his nose as he coughed and choked. Everything was swaying and lurching, up and down, turning his stomach. A flash of lightning lit up the world, cast light on the long narrow space with metal walls and bunks and a galley kitchen. He was in a boat. Realization dawned on Daniel with a sickening lurch of his stomach. His feet barely touching the bottom of the pool, he struggled to a porthole, stared out into the black night. Another fork of lightning. For half a heartbeat Daniel saw the sea, angry and swollen, waves like mountains crashing all around. He tried to be calm in the pitch black. The water was slowly rising, creeping like cold hands. Feeling his way around, Daniel willed his eyes to see through the blackness. He tried to visualize a lamp, a torch, a floodlight, anything to help him see. He imagined himself striking a match, filling the boat with dancing yellow light, and as the picture filled his head, something dropped into his pocket. He reached down and pulled out a box of sodden matches. Desperately he struck one of the matches and was amazed when it sparked to life, just as he had imagined, casting a flickering glow around the tight belly of the boat. He moved out of the galley, banging and stuttering as huge waves tossed the ship to a narrow metal corridor, and found a black door with a golden handle. In his excitement he dropped his light, but when the match hit the cold surface, the flame did not go out. It remained lit. The match sank as if it was made of lead, illuminating the black water as it drifted towards the floor. He struck another match, the light dazzling his eyes in the dark corridor, and he reached for the door. Sharp has underestimated me, he thought, as his hands closed around the handle. But something groaned, loud and metallic and old. There was a ping, and the ship juddered and shook and swung. The sound of rushing water filled Daniel's ears, and he held on tight to whatever his grasping hands could find as the boat began to tip up, to fill with water. The floor became steeper and steeper, climbed and climbed until it was vertical, and all the time the doorway back to the Emporium, to Ellie and Silver and his home, was being submerged, deeper and deeper. Water was spraying everywhere, catching Daniel in the face, filling his nose and mouth. He fell, tumbling, catching his elbow on the metal walls, and landed with a splash in the rising water. Water that would soon fill the entire corridor, the entire ship. Sharp's cruelty shone through, bright as one of Daniel's matches. The idea was simple and brilliant. If Daniel were to escape, he'd have to face his biggest fear, and avoid the same death that his father had suffered, alone in the dark, with nobody's hand to hold. Sharp's door also led to darkness. Though the absence of light did not last, bright lights flickered on all around him, dazzling and familiar, stage lights. The lock on the exit clicked shut. He stood on a grand stage with curtains of black velvet and a floor of polished mahogany. The place seemed vast, though it was difficult to tell. Dazzling light shone at him from out in the theatre, making it impossible to see the audience. But there was an audience there. He could sense it, even if they were oddly silent and still. "This is my challenge?" he asked, flashing perfect teeth. "To perform? To amaze?" He laughed, wondering exactly what it would take to unlock the door. Perhaps some sort of approval from the crowd. Since the boy would soon be dead, it hardly mattered. But something about being on stage again, performing, appealed to him. He took off his coat and threw it in the air, where it became black smoke and evaporated. He looked to the audience. Silence. Perhaps pleasing this crowd would be more challenging than he thought. He tried again, firing a bullet from a gun and catching it across the stage. The crowd was still. Sharp shook his head and cursed. "What do you people want?" he yelled. Something broke the silence, the voice of a young girl. "Let him see me," the voice said. "For this to work, he has to see me. I'm asking for help, Papa. Please let him know that I exist. No more ghosts, no more hiding. It's time to end this." "Hello?" There was a hint of unease in Sharp's voice. Across the stage towards the door, a girl appeared from nowhere. She had eyes the colour of thunderclouds, eyes he recognised, and a tangle of wild black curls. "Who are you?" he asked. She stood perfectly still, staring through him. "My name is Ellie Silver," she said, "and I'm your granddaughter." The boat was almost full of water. Daniel was freezing and weak from his efforts to swim down and budge the door. Each time he tried, the water was deeper, and so the swim to the bottom of the submerged passageway became more of a struggle. This time, as he came back up, there was barely enough space to keep his head above the surface. He did not cry, as he thought he might when he imagined the moment in his nightmares. He only thought of the Emporium and Ellie and Mr. Silver, how he had let them all down if he'd failed. Another deep breath, another lung-bursting swim through the darkness, and again he could not move the door. He swam back to the surface, banging his head on the metal ceiling. His time was almost up. "If I do die here," he thought, "at least it will be fighting for something. At least I didn't sit back and do nothing." He thought of his mother and father, and he wondered what happened when someone died, if he'd see his parents again, or if dying was like flicking a switch and he'd be gone and forgotten, and that was that. His nose was pressed against the ceiling now. He was gasping for breath. And then, As the water closed in around him, he had a thought, a memory, and he heard Mr. Silver's voice as clearly as if he were floating beside him. If, by some curious twist of fate, you find yourself in trouble, the Emporium will help you. All you have to do is ask. The water was in his mouth, in his ears, and in his eyes. "Help me," he said to the Emporium through a mouthful of freezing water. "Please, help me find my way back." One last breath. Daniel felt the water envelop him. He dived because he did not know what else to do. He swam to the door, began one last attempt to open it. His lungs burned. He fought and fought the overwhelming urge to breathe, ignored his body's desperate call for air. He began to fade. And then someone took his hand in the darkness, and another hand was fumbling in his pockets, removing the matches. A flash of blinding light lit up by the black, shaking Daniel back to life. Someone grabbed him around the neck, and he found that he was staring into the face that was both familiar and strange, framed by a mane of hair the same burning orange as his own. The man took Daniel by the wrist and pulled him back towards the door. Then Daniel stared into his eyes, nodded, and began to pull on the door. Daniel's lungs screamed. The pain made his ears ring, and he saw flashes of light in the corners of his vision. But the door was budging. Slowly, surely, it was opening. The man gave Daniel a smile and nodded towards the door. Half in a dream, Daniel nodded back. He reached for the door with hands like lead, and he pulled. The door opened. Daniel was sucked through the doorway like a spider down the plug hole. He landed hard, gasping cool fresh air into his lungs. Water was flowing down the corridor and away. The book of matches lay beside him, and he kissed them and stowed them in his pocket as the Emporium staff mobbed him. They picked him up and patted him on the back and called his name. Every breath was a welcome gift. He was back in the corridor. He was alive. And he was quite sure that the ghost of his dead father had just saved him. "What are you talking about?" Sharp sneered, though there was hesitation in his voice. Ellie took one step towards him. "My papa told me that my mum left me on the doorstep of the Emporium in Edinburgh. He said she was a servant who wanted me to have a better life. I think the servant part was true. That's how you treated her, isn't it?" Sharp stayed very still. "You are not real," he said. "This is a trick." "Is it?" said Ellie. "I'm real. I promise you that. And I know all about you. You're a monster. You're dangerous. Papa's been protecting me from you all this time. He knew you'd take me away, treat me just like you treated her." "Treated who? For pity's sake." Ellie pointed to the crowd. The lights that had been blinding Sharp flickered out. He took a sharp breath and a half step back. There were 1,000 seats in the theatre, and every one of them was taken by the same person. A young woman with red curls and porcelain skin, wearing a white nightgown dyed bright red with blood from the knife that was sticking in her heart. "Michelle?" whispered Sharp. His face was unreadable, but his voice shook. "You treated her like dirt," said Ellie. "She was my mum, and you used her to break my papa's heart and steal his book. She hid away from you while you travelled and made your fortune, and she didn't tell you about me because, in the end, she wasn't like you. There was good in her." "What do you want me to say?" said Sharp. Ellie returned the cold stare. "Say you're sorry, and you mean it. That's all you have to do to open the door, to win." Silence. Sharp stood centre stage just the way he liked it. He smiled. "I don't have to do a damn thing," he said. He motioned to the door. "Out there, through a door just like this one, Daniel Holmes is dying. When his body goes limp and his last breath is gone, this door will unlock, and the Book of Wonders will be mine." No sooner had he finished speaking when the lock on the door clicked, and the door swung open. Sharp's coat appeared in his hands, and he put it on and gave Ellie a cruel smile. "You see," he said, "it was only a matter of how long Mr. Holmes could hold his breath." "Actually, I'm quite good at holding my breath." Daniel was sodden. He stood at the door, the Book of Wonders in his hands. The smug look on Sharp's face vanished. "Impossible," he said. Daniel raised a finger in correction. "You're in the Nowhere Emporium, Mr. Sharp. Nothing's impossible." He held up the book. "You lose. The book stays here where it belongs." Sharp stared at Daniel, wild fury in his eyes. "But there is no way out. How did you escape?" Daniel patted the doorway. "I know things you don't," he said, ignoring Sharp when he scoffed. "I know that you and Mr. Silver had a challenge of your own. I know that challenge never ended. Don't you see? We're a part of it, Ellie and me, players in the same game. This was a challenge within a challenge. We were fighting for Mr. Silver. So, here's how it is. Everything we agreed stands. You have to go and never come back. But everything you agreed with Mr. Silver all those years ago also stands. You have to stop stealing life from innocent people, stealing their time, their tomorrow. You have to grow old, and one day you have to die." Sharp spat on the stage floor, his face flushed brilliant red. "Where is he hiding?" Daniel smiled. He held up the Book of Wonders. "In the book, he told you once that the book was part of him, part of his soul. You had the book in your hands, Sharp. You had Silver in your hands, and you never knew. If you hadn't been so arrogant." Sharp moved so quickly, a blur in the shadows. Ellie screamed. Sharp was behind her, holding her tight, a knife to her throat. Behind Daniel, the crowd gasped. "You have taken something from me today, Daniel Holmes, and nobody takes anything from me. So I intend to take something from you. The girl is my blood. She will come with me. Step aside or I slit her throat." Daniel shook his head. "You don't understand, do you? The Emporium wants you to leave. I'd listen to it if I were you." Out in the theatre audience, the many versions of Michelle Sharp left their seats and began to lumber towards the stage. They climbed the steps, the slow walk of the dead, and formed a ring around Sharp. "Stop this!" he yelled. "Stop it! I'll kill her!" Cold hands wrapped around his wrist, prized the dagger from his grip. Ellie aimed a kick at his shins, squirmed free, and wriggled through the crowd to Daniel. "You took your time," she said. "Can we finish this now?" Then they turned back to Sharp, who was fighting through the crowd towards the door. "I may have lost," he yelled, battering away one of the many Michelles, "but nowhere in our agreement did it state that I had to leave you in one piece." He reached into his coat, and his blades gleamed in the stage lights. The first two daggers missed their target, plunging deep into the wall beside the door, level with Daniel's head. But Sharp's third throw was true, and the knife spun through the dark theatre towards Daniel's heart. A flash of silver, a chattering call, and the magpie swooped down in front of him, wings spread wide. The dagger hit the bird in the chest, and the magpie exploded in a cloud of rubies, raining to the ground with a sound like falling stars. Sharp let out a roar of anger. He ran towards Daniel, knocking many versions of his dead daughter out of his path, his teeth clenched, veins popping in his forehead and neck. Daniel opened the book. He tried to stay calm as he found the correct page, and ripped it out. At once the floor of the theatre began to break, to crumble, and fall to infinite darkness. The fury in Sharp's face had been replaced by cold fear. He quickened his pace, leaping as sections of the floor disappeared beneath him. The Emporium's glittering bricks closed in around the door, suffocating the doorway. One final roar and he leapt for the exit, but he fell short and tumbled into the abyss as the door disappeared, sealing him in a nightmare forever. The Emporium was silent, and then the staff roared, and Daniel and Ellie were surrounded by cheering people, wanting to hug them, to lift them, to carry them on their shoulders. "Give them space!" cried Caleb. "They haven't finished yet." Daniel scrunched the page up. He handed it to Ellie, took the matches from his pocket and lit one of them. Ellie held the page to the orange flame. They watched it burn together until all that remained was a small pile of ash. Chapter 37. Pages in the Wind. The front of the shop was still and silent. Everything about the place, from the teetering columns of books to the wondrous array of shimmering treasures and the warmth of the fire, remained unchanged from the very first time Daniel had stumbled through the doors. He placed the Book of Wonders on Silver's desk, beside Sharp's empty whiskey bottle. The air in the Emporium seemed to become heavy, like the air before a storm. The Book of Wonders trembled, the cover cracked open, slamming on the wooden desk. Pages flipped and fanned, a whistle sounded, the high-pitched shriek of a boiling kettle, and the book leapt high into the air. Slap! It landed on the desk and lay still, open at the scorched pages. Words began to form on the burned paper, tiny black ink letters scrawling across the page, and then the words broke free of the page and floated upwards. They banded together, loops and flourishes of ink forming feathered tendrils that shifted and twisted and twined in the air like smoke. Details formed, the flash of a hand, what might be an eye. Slowly, surely, the words took the shape of a man wearing a dusty grey suit, a man with thundercloud eyes and a head full of wild, tangled brown hair, a living, breathing, solid person. Mr. Silver blinked. He rubbed a hand across his forehead and shook the cobwebs from his brain. He looked much older than Daniel remembered. "Well," he said, "that stung more than I imagined." Ellie leapt on him, knocking a cloud of dust from his suit. "Papa! Oh, Papa! Papa!" Silver held her tightly. He placed his hands upon his daughter's face, wiped away her tears with his thumbs, and looked into her eyes, a mirror of his own. "I am so very sorry that I left you. I promise there was no other way." He glanced at Daniel and said, "But you know that, don't you? You know everything." Daniel said, "Sharp told me that after such a long time the Emporium was becoming too much for you." Mr. Silver smiled, and his eyes were sad. "It began 5 or 6 years ago. At first, I barely noticed, but as time dragged on, I began to feel the strain, to feel my grip on the Emporium loosening. I knew that my powers were fading, and each time we moved on, I felt Vindictus Sharp edge closer. There were a few very close calls. He almost caught up with us in Barcelona." "And that's why you needed the unicorn blood, isn't it?" said Daniel. "Initially, I intended to use it to prolong my life, just enough to find a suitable replacement. But things moved too quickly. I was forced to act." Daniel said, "I invited Sharp into the Emporium, Mr. Silver. None of this would have happened if I hadn't. I'm sorry." Silver held up a hand. "You, my boy, have nothing to be sorry about. Sharp would have found a way in eventually. He'd been watching us. He tricked his way into Ellie's birthday ball, and that's when I made the decision to go into hiding. Sharp had remained strong by stealing other people's futures. In my weakened state, I would have been no match for him. He would have taken the book, and the Emporium would have been lost. I used the unicorn blood and almost every drop of my remaining magical strength to place myself in the book. But I did not abandon you, despite how it might have seemed. I retained a link to the outside world, something small, something that wouldn't take too much effort to sustain. The magpies." "You and the magpies?" Daniel said. "Always," said Silver. "They were my ears and my eyes. I realised as things unfolded that I would have to lead you to the truth about Sharp, a terrible truth, a truth I wished I rather had remained buried." Mr. Silver looked at the floor then, and he seemed to Daniel to become a small boy waiting to be scolded. Ellie said, "It's true we saw everything. We saw what happened on the night you went to get the book back from Sharp, but it wasn't your fault. You didn't kill her." Silver looked up, and there were tears in his grey eyes. "For over 100 years, I've been running from the past. It's a relief that you finally know the truth. I wish I could go back, Ellie, and change what happened. You can, said Ellie. You can do anything. Go back and stop Sharp before he throws the knife. Kill him before he kills you. Silver looked almost tortured then. I'm not a monster, Ellie. And you know that's not how it works. If I change the past, I change the present. We'll all be different people, shaped by different experiences. We won't exist as we do now. And I do not wish to lose the you that I know. Ellie dabbed at her eyes with a knuckle. Michelle was really my mum, and she just left me on the doorstep like a bag of rubbish. Your mother was not a bad woman, said Sylve with a shake of the head. She was manipulated by a master, but she knew that when you were born she had to give you up. She didn't wish you to be treated as she had been, or worse, for you to be taken away from her and raised by Sharp, so she brought you here. It was quite a surprise to find you on the doorstep, and Sharp has always been the reason I have insisted you cannot leave. It's not because I'm lonely, it's not because I don't love you. I love you most of all, Ellie, more than you can imagine. You're the one thing in this world that I've got right. As long as you remained inside the Emporium, I can ensure that Sharp couldn't harm you, couldn't even see you. You have always been safe. Not if the Emporium falls apart around me, said Ellie. Silver scratched his head. I would never have put you in danger like that. It was all in my note. He stopped. Ah, yes. The note didn't quite work out as I'd hoped. Ellie reached into her pocket. Oh, you mean this note? She waved the scrap of paper. The note that tells us absolutely nothing? Silver stared at it. Yes, he said, plucking the note from Ellie's hand and sniffing the burned edges. Got scorched along with the book. Bit of a mistake. My plan was quite similar to Daniel's, as it turns out, and part of the note says that you are now free to leave the Emporium at any time you wished. He smiled and nodded towards the door. There's nothing to hide from now. The world is yours. Ellie's eyes bugged open. She looked at the door. A familiar rumble came from behind the curtain. The shop shivered, and the flames in the fire dulled and hiccuped. Mr. Silver staggered backwards, and then regained his footing and charged to his desk, picking up the book. We don't have much time. If the Emporium is to be saved, then it must be passed to someone else, someone who is up to the challenge. He patted the battered cover. When I first began my search for a successor, I never imagined that the book would choose someone so young. His hand rested on Daniel's shoulder. What do you say, Daniel Holmes? The question was too huge to fit entirely into Daniel's head. It took him some time to answer. Me? Take over the Emporium? I'm just a boy, I don't know how. You are old enough and wise enough to defeat an ancient and dangerous man, and you will not be alone. Another rumble. Silver folded into his seat, clutching at his chest. If I say no, said Daniel, the Emporium will die. Is that a fair thing to ask someone? Mr. Silver said, Everything has its season, Daniel. If today is the day that the Emporium passes into history, then it will certainly not be your fault. The blame for all of this lies with me. Daniel's mind was bursting with questions, with ideas and fears and excitement. I don't think I could do what you've done. Live like you've lived, he said. I don't want to steal anyone's imagination. Mr. Silver held up his hands. You won't need to. If anyone has the imagination to power the Emporium, it is you. My dear boy, I would never demand that you live with the mistakes I have made, and I have made many. It will be a clean slate, a blank page, your Emporium, your rules, your life. I could be normal, said Daniel. I could grow up and grow old and pass the Emporium on to someone else when I think it's a time. Silver smiled. Aye. I think that would be a very wise way to live. Daniel's gaze found Ellie. He wondered what was going on in her head, how she felt about her father passing the torch to someone other than herself. And then, as though reading his thoughts, she gave him a smile, showing the gap between her front teeth, and a nod. Mr. Silver offered a hand. Do we have a bargain? Will the staff be okay? Caleb and Anya and the others?" "The ones who survived will stay with you," said Silver. He rubbed at his eyes. "But I'm afraid to say there is no bringing back those who perished. They came from my mind, my imagination. You will have to write some new stuff." Daniel thought about the vastness of the Emporium. The shop was many things. It was a magical place, a place where anything was possible, a place with the power to bring happiness to the hearts of those who visited, those who believed. But to Daniel, most of all, it was his home. The Emporium was where he belonged, at last. He shook Mr. Silver's hand. As their fingers touched, Daniel felt a shiver run up his spine. Something seemed to wrap around him like an invisible blanket, and then it was gone, and their hands came apart. The air between them crackled. Mr. Silver handed Daniel the Book of Wonders, and as Daniel held it, the cracked and worn cover began to repair, until the leather was smooth and shining. The golden letters shone clear once more, only this time the name on the cover was not Mr. Silver's. Daniel stared at the inscription. "The Wonders of Daniel Holmes." "It's done." Daniel felt it in the same way that you feel someone is watching you, or that a storm is coming. He felt the Emporium in his chest and in his head and in his blood. It was part of him, and he was part of it. Silver beamed at him, though there was sadness in his eyes. He held out a hand to Ellie. "Would you like to take a walk together?" Silver asked, pointing to the exit. Ellie stared at the door, and then at her father. She nodded. Silver took her hand. "Are you coming back?" Daniel asked. Silver did not have to utter a word to answer the question. His eyes told Daniel everything. We're not coming back," said Ellie. Silver kissed his daughter's hand. "You may return if you wish," he said. "You have a life to live, a canvas to paint. What you do is up to you. Grow old, Ellie. Fall in love and out of love and travel the world. You stand at the beginning of your path, but this will be my last walk." Ellie pulled away from him. "What are you saying?" "I'm tired, Ellie. More exhausted than you can imagine. The very last of my energy is about to run dry. When I walk out of the Emporium, away from the magic, I will not be able to hold myself together any longer. Nothing can stop it now." "You can't go away," said Ellie, her voice trembling. "I've only just begun to get to know you properly." Mr. Silver placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ellie, I would very much like to take one walk up in the fresh air with my daughter before my time is up," Ellie said. "Will it hurt when you go?" "I don't believe so. I'd like to imagine that it will be as pleasant as stepping from a cold shadow into warm sunshine." He smiled and winked an eye the colour of thunder. "Are you ready?" "No, but I'll walk with you." "And Daniel," said Mr. Silver, "you will find help in the Book of Wonders. I have left an echo of my knowledge within the pages. It will guide you when you need it." Daniel gave a nod. "Thanks," he said, and he meant it more than he had ever meant anything. "Thank you for everything." Silver took his hat from the stand by the door, placed it onto his head, and tipped the brim towards Daniel. "Thank you, Daniel Holmes. I wish you the adventure of a lifetime." The bell sang as Silver opened the door to the perfect autumn day, a golden sun high in the powder blue sky. Daniel watched as they walked through the door, and found himself smiling as Ellie took her first steps in the outside world. They walked, father and daughter, hand in hand, up the street to the corner of the block, where the sunlight shone brightest upon the sidewalk. Time seemed to slow in the bustling Manhattan street as Silver kissed Ellie on the forehead. He said something, and she nodded, and they hugged. Then a breeze whispered between the buildings, and in the time it took to blink, Mr. Silver was gone, leaving hundreds of blank book pages in his place, twirling and soaring around Ellie in the wind, flashing in the autumn light of the sun. She watched the pages for the longest time, dabbing at her eyes until the last of them had become nothing more than a speck in the sky. Then she turned and walked slowly back to the Emporium, where Daniel held open the door. She collapsed into her father's chair. "Are you all right?" Daniel wished he had something better to say. A lot had changed, but crying girls still left him stumped. She peeked at him from behind her hands. "No, I'm not." A pause. "I saw my dad," said Daniel, "during the duel with Sharp. He helped me. I know it wasn't him, not the real him anyway. The shop created an echo from my memories. I always thought I didn't remember anything about him. Turns out he's been with me all along. He always will be. I don't think I'll have nightmares anymore." Ellie gave him a smile. She wiped her eyes and stood up. She made her way around the shop to a device that steered the Emporium, the one with the many rings and numbers. "Where should we go then?" Daniel narrowed his eyes. "We?" "You heard Papa. He told you to go and have an adventure, so let's go. There's a big world out there and it's ours, all of it." "You'll stay?" "I felt the sun on my face today, Daniel, the real sun, and I can feel it any time I want. Knowing I can leave, just knowing, that's enough for now." Daniel couldn't contain his joy. Ellie could be impossible. She was maddening and infuriating, but she was also loyal and brave. She was his friend, his sister, and he could not imagine a better one. He ran over and hugged her tight. "Are you feeling all right?" she said. Daniel thought about the question. He was nervous and terrified, excited and proud. He felt the weight of the Emporium on his shoulders, the pull of the world at his feet. He felt ready. Most of all, he felt alive. He felt at home. A smile danced at the edges of his mouth as he reached for the dusty old atlas and opened the pages. And then Daniel Holmes and Ellie Silver began to argue, as only dearest friends can, about far-off shores and exotic-sounding places, and where they might find their next great adventure. Perhaps one day they will visit the place where you live. Perhaps you will hear people whispering about the appearance of a strange shop built from bricks the colour of midnight. Perhaps you will witness the shimmering golden gate turn to dust and the fireworks sign in the sky. And maybe, if you truly believe, you will walk through the red curtain and witness the wonders and secrets of the Nowhere Emporium with your own eyes. But then again, maybe you already have.